Everyone is talking about tree planting at the moment, and that can result in a positive thing. In a large proportion of what's happening, it's not. No one is talking about aftercare, and this is misnomer about putting a tree in the ground and that being a great thing. It only is if it lives, you know, it only is if it gets looked after, it only is if it's the right tree for that soil type, for that reason, for the, you know, the reason that we want X from it.
There's a lot of talk now, we all got to go out and plant trees to save the planet. And it drives me up the wall because, you know, planting a tree is the easy bit. Getting that tree to grow and, you know, to survive all, you know, the weeds initially, to have the right microbiotic community in the soil to nourish that tree, and then to protect it from squirrels and rabbits and deer is extremely difficult. And I suppose our 20 years of experimenting with it on the farm have mostly been pretty unsuccessful, actually.
Nature does do the work for us. It does take those efforts, you know, if we put them in the right way. But we can't just have this kind of greenwash that says, let's just take this field and we'll put some trees in, and then, you know, in 30 years' time, we'll cut them down for biomass, probably. Or actually, no one's going to water them in 3 years, so the summers are getting hotter and they're all going to die anyway. The Woodland Trust have got this motto, the right tree in the right place. And I think we take it a step further, the right tree in the right place for the right reason with the right people to look after it.
It is a bit of a challenge, and there is definitely a big knowledge gap. That range of skills that would have existed within a rural community, sometimes within a large farm, the ability to look after all sorts of livestock and manage all sorts of crops and look after the forest. You know, we would have, you know, been out here coppicing the hazels and, you know, harvesting the firewood and using the hazels to make hurdles, and, you know, all these skills, you know, they've all been lost. The generation that knew how to do those things are largely gone.
Domestically, in this country, we're the second biggest importer of timber in the world. If everyone wanted to build their things out of British timber, we're not even close. It's not even fathomable that we'd be able to do that. We wouldn't have any woods left. In England, we have around 10% woodland cover. Many of the woods are unmanaged. And when they're unmanaged, it means the woods grow up, they grow dark, and low in biodiversity and low in productivity. Forestry is kind of like sculpting with light in that respect, you know, opening up the canopy to let light to the floor, to let new stuff grow up. And we've been curating that process for so long that if we stop, okay, eventually it'll be fine, but it'll take a few hundred years, right? We can start doing that work and working with it in a kind of symbiotic way. The Woodland Presents is essentially trying to look at the predicament we're in with woodlands and forests and trees and say, okay, how do we respond in a meaningful and positive way to this? Where we're coming from as an organisation is getting the resources to the people who know how to take those trees on, how to really make them into flourishing ecosystems and very productive landscapes. Because if we're not doing that, then there's no point. There really isn't. It might make us feel better, but ultimately, you need the people. There are people in this country that know how to do this work, and to enable them and to resource them and to give them the opportunity to do that is the essential thing. Forestry itself always gets kind of banded as an afterthought. You know, in terms of funding or in terms of policy, it's kind of like agriculture's ugly sister. What needs to happen is much more of an integration with forestry and woodland management and agroforestry in together with land use more generally. In terms of food production, it's essential that we start working with farmers, we start working with people who are exploring the boundaries and blurring the boundaries between growing trees for timber and growing trees for food.
Prior to, I think it was 1970, 50% of the anthropogenic man-made carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was due to land use change in agriculture. It is a huge, huge issue, which I think is only just starting to be considered. You know, so can we design a system of food production that not only produces the food that we need and like to eat, but also is in harmony with nature, you know, supports biodiversity and hopefully sequesters carbon as well. That's the holy grail, and I think it's absolutely possible. Well, I know it's possible. We know how to do it.
We've got this opportunity to amplify the potential that we know trees can offer us in the way that we're planting them, by adopting some agroforestry practices, and by being clever about which species we're planting, where species can provide us with timber and food and have short-term returns and long-term returns or mid-term returns. If it's not targeted, if it's not thought about on multiple different levels, and not just on our temporal scale, not within our lifetime, but within generations, I mean, that's a fundamental problem we have as humans, and we can't seem to get around this issue, especially because of the economics. So if you have an economic reason to plant a tree, it almost certainly does not concur with what a woodland would want. So how do we start changing that, and how do we start paying attention to the woodlands that we've got, and how do we start growing straight trees again in amongst increasing biodiversity? That's the million-dollar question at the moment. How do we provide for our needs as a species whilst increasing biodiversity